Imagine children huddled in a damp underground tunnel, their knees pulled up to their chests, books resting awkwardly on their laps. The sound of bombs rumbles overhead, dust trickles from the ceiling, and the air is heavy with the anxious breathing of hundreds of families packed into the shelter. And yet, through it all, a voice cuts steadily through the chaos, a teacher's voice, calm, patient, unwavering. "Now," he says, "who can spell the word courage?" This is the image of London in the Blitz, where classrooms no longer stood on solid ground, but were scattered across basements, church halls, and the crowded depths of the underground. Education did not stop when the bombs fell. For many children, school was no longer desks in neat rows or chalkboards gleaming in the morning sun. School became a corner of a shelter lit by a lantern, a patch of rubble cleared in a half-destroyed hall, or even a teacher's lap as he read aloud above the noise of war. Our story begins with one such teacher, an ordinary man, who refused to abandon his calling. He was not a soldier, not a politician, not a figure carved in marble. He was a schoolmaster, one of thousands across Britain who carried on in impossible conditions. His name may be forgotten by history. Perhaps it was Thomas or George or Arthur, but his voice lived on in the memories of children who survived the Blitz because he never stopped teaching. When the first bombs fell on London in September 1940, schools were among the earliest casualties. Buildings were shattered, classrooms burned, playgrounds vanished under rubble. Parents were told to evacuate their children to the countryside, but not all could bear to part with them, and not all children were moved. For those who stayed, normal life seemed to vanish overnight. Days became endless sirens, and nights became a descent into tunnels where fear sat on every shoulder. But for this teacher, fear was not the final word. He looked at the children around him, his students, his responsibility, and saw not victims, but learners. War might destroy walls and windows, but it could not silence the act of teaching. And so, armed with nothing but a piece of chalk and a handful of battered books, he created a classroom wherever he could find space. Picture him leading children into the cellar of a half-broken church, brushing plaster dust from a pew to make room for a copybook. Or see him standing in a tube station, lantern light catching his worn face, as he teaches spelling, while the ground above quivers with explosions. In those moments, he was more than a teacher. He was a shield, a symbol that life continued, that childhood could be preserved even under fire. Parents understood this instinctively. Many brought their children to his lessons not just for reading or arithmetic, but for sanity. A child kept busy with sums and stories had less time to dwell on fear. A teacher's voice could soothe when even a mother's embrace could not. And so, as raids stretched on and nights blurred into weeks, this teacher's work became as vital as the fire wardens who patrolled the rooftops or the nurses who bandaged the wounded. He was fighting, not with water or bandages, but with words, numbers, and the promise of a future beyond the war. One evening, deep in the underground, as a raid pounded the city above, he asked his students to write sentences about what they dreamed of. One girl, no more than 8, scrawled, "I dream of my house not broken." Another wrote, "I dream of my father coming home." When he read their words, his throat tightened, but he did not falter. He praised them for their spelling, for their handwriting, for their courage, because in that moment, correcting a misspelling was not about the mistake. It was about preserving the normal rhythm of school, about giving children the comfort of routine in a world that had lost all order. And in those shelters, education became an act of defiance. Each letter written, each story read aloud, each recited poem was a small victory against the destruction raging above. The bombs could break bricks, but they could not break a child's ability to learn so long as a teacher refused to give up. For the children, those lessons mattered more than they knew. Years later, many would look back not just on the fear of the Blitz, but on the strange calm of sitting cross-legged with a book, listening to the voice of a teacher who carried on as if the world had not ended. To them, He was not just a man with chalk and paper. He was proof that hope could survive underground. By the autumn of 1940, London had already endured weeks of nightly bombardment. Entire districts were reduced to rubble. Rows of terraced houses stood hollowed out, their facades ripped away like doll houses split in half. Among the ruins lay hundreds of schools, institutions that had once been bustling centres of routine and laughter. Some were closed indefinitely. Others stood cracked and dangerous, their blackboards buried beneath dust and splinters. The government faced a desperate question. How could education continue in a city under siege? The official answer was evacuation. Millions of children had already been moved to the countryside in Operation Pied Piper, a vast relocation effort meant to save young lives and preserve learning in safer environments. But the evacuation was never total. Parents hesitated to send their children away, fearing they might never see them again. Some families had nowhere to send them. Others were separated when children were evacuated, while mothers remained behind, leading to unbearable loneliness. In many working-class neighborhoods, thousands of children stayed. And so, with school buildings in ruins and official classrooms scattered, the burden fell to the teachers themselves. Many were young women, scarcely older than their senior pupils, while others were veterans of decades in the classroom. Each morning, they asked the same question: where can we teach today? Sometimes the answer was a church hall, the pews pushed aside to make space for writing slates. Sometimes it was a drafty cellar where candles barely lit the exercise books. In a few cases, children sat cross-legged on the floor of half-bombed classrooms, their coats pulled tight against the cold wind that swept through shattered windows. Lessons might be interrupted by sirens, forcing teachers to guide their pupils down into basements or tube stations, and yet once there, many picked up right where they left off. Now, let's return to our sums. One account tells of a teacher in South London who held her lessons in the crypt of a church. Each morning, she walked her pupils past rubble-strewn streets, guided them down the stone steps, and set them to work on spelling, while the air smelled of damp stone and candle wax. Another remembered teaching under canvas in a public park, the children's voices competing with the hum of aircraft circling above. These improvised classrooms might not have had desks or chalkboards, but they carried something more essential: the determination that learning must not stop. Parents supported the effort in any way they could. Some brought blankets to soften the hard ground of shelters. Others donated scraps of paper, half-burned pencils, or old books salvaged from ruins. The scarcity of materials was constant. Children often shared one exercise book between 2 or 3, writing on opposite pages so as not to waste space. And yet, the shortage became part of the lesson itself. Teachers reminded pupils that thrift, creativity, and perseverance were as valuable as mathematics or history. The Ministry of Education encouraged this persistence, publishing pamphlets urging schools to keep operating in whatever form circumstances allow. Inspectors, when they could visit, often turned a blind eye to irregular arrangements, recognizing that in wartime, the very act of keeping children gathered and occupied was victory enough. But perhaps the most striking classrooms of all were the London tube shelters. By night they filled with thousands of families escaping the bombing. By day, when the trains resumed their rumble, teachers returned to organize small lessons for children who had spent the night underground. Chalkboards were hung on tunnel walls. Sheets were spread across benches to create makeshift desks. A hum of spelling, arithmetic, and whispered reading spread through the tunnels, blending with the constant echo of footsteps. These teachers were not unaware of the risks. Any gathering of children in wartime Britain was vulnerable. Several times, schools that had remained open were struck directly, resulting in heartbreaking losses. Teachers knew this could happen again, yet they chose to continue. To stop teaching would have been to surrender something deeper than a building. And so, each improvised classroom carried with it a sense of defiance. A math lesson in a church crypt was more than arithmetic. It was a statement that knowledge still mattered, that life could not be reduced to fear and rubble. A spelling test in a tube station was more than practice. It was a declaration that the next generation would not grow up illiterate simply because bombs had fallen from the sky. Children themselves responded with remarkable resilience. They laughed when a teacher's chalk broke, or when a mouse scurried through the shelter. They recited poems loudly, as if their voices might drown out the sirens above. And when they stumbled over words, teachers encouraged them gently, reminding them that mistakes were part of learning, and that mistakes mattered far less than giving up. For many of those children, these lessons became the anchor of their childhood. Amid the chaos of war, the regularity of school, even a broken, improvised school, was a reminder that they still belonged to a world larger than the Blitz. They were not only refugees in their own city, they were students, and students have futures. And so, while firemen fought flames and wardens enforced blackouts, another army worked quietly underground and in ruins: the teachers. Their battlefield was the classroom. Their weapons were chalk and words, and their victory was the continuation of learning in the face of destruction. Imagine being 8 years old in London, 1940. You walk to school one morning and find the windows blown out, the roof half collapsed, and your classroom buried in ash and plaster. Yet, as you stand there, your teacher appears, carrying a bundle of exercise books under her arm. She smiles, brushes the dust from her skirt, and says, "Well, children, let's find somewhere else to learn today." That was the daily reality for countless boys and girls in the Blitz, and for the teachers who refused to let war steal their purpose. One of the most vivid testimonies comes from a boy named Peter, who remembered lessons in a shelter beneath his school in East London. The shelter smelled of damp earth and candle smoke. Rats sometimes darted through the corners. Yet each morning, their teacher, Miss Morgan, led them down with a lantern in hand. She would read aloud from Dickens, her voice steady, even as distant thuds echoed above. The children listened wide-eyed, their imaginations escaping to Victorian London instead of the bomb-shattered streets outside. Years later, Peter recalled, "She gave us something no bomb could destroy, a sense that life went on, that stories still mattered." In Suffolk, a young teacher named Mrs. Clark organized spelling competitions by candlelight. The children huddled close, their pencils scratching on salvaged scraps of paper. When the air raid siren wailed mid-lesson, she simply paused, waited for the echoes to fade, and then said, "All right. Where were we? Oh yes, courage. How do we spell it?" The children laughed nervously, but they kept writing. To them, the very word courage seemed to define their teacher. There were countless others like her, teachers who stood in front of classes with bandaged arms after surviving a blast, teachers who arrived each day in borrowed shoes because their own had been burned in fires, teachers who opened their homes to pupils when the school was unusable, clearing dining tables so lessons could continue. Each one carried an invisible weight, balancing their own fears with the responsibility of keeping children steady. Parents, too, noticed. One mother wrote in her diary about how the sight of her son reciting multiplication tables in a half-destroyed chapel gave her strength. "If he can learn his sevens by heart while bombs are falling, then I can face another night." The resilience of the children mirrored the resilience of the adults, creating a feedback loop of courage that bound families and schools together. Life underground also became strangely communal. In tube stations, teachers improvised classrooms with chalkboards propped against tunnel walls. A father might sit nearby, mending boots while children copied sums in their notebooks. Babies cried, trains rattled overhead, and yet learning went on. Sometimes older children helped the younger ones, forming makeshift study groups that turned the shelters into miniature schools. For a few hours each day, the tube was not only a refuge from bombs, but a refuge from despair. The emotional bond between teacher and pupil grew stronger in these conditions. Many children later recalled how their teachers became second parents during the Blitz, figures of stability when their own families were shattered or dispersed. One girl, evacuated briefly and then returned to London, said her teacher, S voice was the first thing that made her feel safe again. When Miss Carter read to us, it was like the war went quiet for a while. Education during the Blitz was not polished or consistent. Lessons were often interrupted, homework sometimes impossible. But what endured was the message that children mattered, that their minds deserved to be nurtured even when the world outside seemed to collapse. Teachers understood that they were not simply filling time, they were protecting the spirit of a generation. And so day after day they persisted. Through smoke, rubble and exhaustion they carried on. The chalk they used might break, the books might be tattered, the walls might shake. But the lessons continued, whispering defiance to the skies above. When the last bombs of the Blitz finally ceased, Londoners emerged into a city that looked more like a scarred battlefield than a capital. Streets were lined with ruins, and gaps in neighborhoods marked where entire families had once lived. Yet among the rubble, something else had survived. The lessons, the routines, and the invisible resilience sown in the minds of children. For many of those boys and girls, the experience of being taught in shelters, cellars, and broken classrooms became a defining memory. It was not only the multiplication tables or the reading practice they recalled, it was the steadiness of their teachers, the reminder that even in chaos, order could exist. A number of children from the Blitz years later said that it was those makeshift lessons that gave them a sense of identity. We were still students. We weren't just victims of the war. As these children grew older, the lessons of resilience carried over into their adult lives. Some went on to serve in the armed forces later in the war, recalling that their discipline had first been drilled into them not by sergeants, but by teachers refusing to surrender the classroom. Others entered public service, determined to help rebuild the very schools that had once been destroyed. Architects, engineers, and planners of post-war Britain were often the same children who had done their spelling tests in tube stations. One striking example is of a young boy named Harold, who studied by candlelight in an Anderson shelter during the Blitz. He would later describe how his fascination with numbers, nurtured by his teacher's persistence, drove him to become an engineer. In the 1950s, Harold helped design housing estates for families who had lost everything in the war, a direct link between a childhood education in the Blitz and the reconstruction of a nation. The legacy extended beyond careers. The Blitz generation became deeply aware of the fragility and value of education itself. Many of them, as parents later in the 1950s and 1960s, placed extraordinary emphasis on sending their children to school, on ensuring they had proper supplies, and on respecting the work of teachers. The endurance of their own education in the darkest of times taught them that learning was not a luxury, it was survival. For the teachers, too, the war years left an indelible mark. Some who had taught in bombed-out classrooms carried the trauma of those experiences with them for life. Others remembered them as their proudest moments. One teacher wrote in her memoirs, "I was no soldier, I was no warden, I was no nurse. But I fought my war with chalk and books, and I believe I did my part." The government, after 1945, recognized the extraordinary role teachers had played. Reports compiled during the war showed how education had been maintained against all odds. These reports influenced post-war educational reform, including the landmark 1944 Education Act, which expanded free secondary schooling. The act was in many ways a tribute to the idea that every child, no matter how poor or vulnerable, deserved an education, even in times of national crisis. And perhaps the most enduring legacy was psychological. Psychologists who studied the Blitz generation later found that children who had attended makeshift schools displayed stronger resilience and adaptability as adults. They had learned, at an early age, to adjust to disruption, to value routine, and to find hope in continuity. A math lesson given underground was more than arithmetic. It was a lesson in endurance. In post-war Britain, the stories of these teachers often went untold, overshadowed by the heroics of firemen, wardens, and soldiers. Yet their contribution was no less vital. They preserved the intellectual and emotional fabric of a generation, ensuring that when the war was over, Britain did not only have survivors, it had thinkers, workers, and dreamers prepared to rebuild. The Blitz destroyed thousands of schools, but it did not destroy education, and that was because teachers refused to give up, even when the walls around them crumbled. The war ended, but the echoes of the Blitz lingered in memory. In London, children who had once huddled in tube stations now grew up, started families, and walked past the same platforms on their way to work. They remembered not only the fear of sirens and bombs, but also the voices of teachers who had stood firm in the dark, chalk in hand, refusing to let lessons die. For those children, now adults, the act of learning had become inseparable from the act of surviving. They knew that while fire brigades had saved lives and soldiers had fought battles abroad, it was teachers who had fought the daily war of the spirit, keeping hope alive when despair seemed inevitable. Their classrooms had been crypts, cellars, tunnels, and half-ruined buildings. Their textbooks were often borrowed or salvaged. Their pencils were stubs, and their chalkboards cracked. Yet the knowledge they passed on was as steady and unbreakable as steel. In post-war Britain, as schools were rebuilt and new policies enacted, the memory of wartime teachers remained like a quiet undercurrent. Parents who had once been pupils in shelters urged their children to study, to appreciate the privilege of desks, windows, and whole roofs over their heads. Many said that the most valuable lesson they had ever learned was not written in a textbook at all. It was written in the courage of their teachers. One student decades later remembered sitting in a damp cellar while his teacher read poetry by candlelight. The bombs thundered outside, dust shook from the ceiling, and yet the teacher's voice never faltered. He recalled, "It wasn't the poem itself that saved me. It was the sound of her voice, calm, certain, as if she believed the world could be rebuilt line by line." And that perhaps was the truest power of these quiet heroes. They showed that resistance could take many forms, not only through fire hoses or helmets, but through lessons whispered underground, sums written on scraps of paper, and poems read in the dark. They proved that education was not a fragile luxury of peace, but a force capable of withstanding war itself. Today, when we think of the Blitz, we often picture the searchlights, the crumbling houses, the firemen on ladders, the wardens shouting orders in the blackout. But if we listen more closely, we might also hear the scratch of a pencil in a tube station, or the low hum of children reciting multiplication tables by lantern light. Those sounds were no less defiant than the roar of aircraft overhead. They were the sounds of a nation refusing to let its future be extinguished. The teachers who never stopped classes may not appear in statues or grand memorials. Their names are often forgotten, buried in dusty archives, or remembered only in the recollections of their former pupils. Yet their impact was monumental. By keeping education alive, they kept Britain's spirit unbroken. They proved that even in war, humanity could still be nurtured, and that the act of teaching, simple, stubborn, ordinary, could be as heroic as any act of combat. In every classroom rebuilt after the war, in every child who grew up to build homes, write books, heal the sick, or teach the next generation, their legacy endures. They were the guardians of tomorrow, carrying the flame of knowledge through the darkest nights of war. And though they wore no uniforms and carried no weapons, they fought with everything they had. Their victory was not celebrated in parades or medals. It was celebrated in silence, in the steady continuation of learning, in the resilience of a generation. And in the survival of hope, and in that quiet victory, they earned their place among the true heroes of the Blitz.